Right now, as you are watching this, a mountain in Peru is being held together by something almost nobody has photographed. The story you know is simple. Machu Picchu, royal estate of the Emperor Pachacuti, built in the 15th century, walked by more than 1 million visitors every year. Terraces, temples, the postcard. But over the last few years, 4 separate teams pointed 4 different technologies at that site. Genome sequencing, laser scanners flown on drones, excavation beneath the terraces, fault mapping from satellites. None of them were looking for the same thing. None of them were working together. And every one of them came back with the same answer, and it is not the answer printed in the guidebook. Because what sits underneath Machu Picchu is larger, older, and considerably stranger than the city standing on top of it, and almost none of it is visible from the trail. To find the first piece of this, you have to leave the citadel. 5 miles down the valley, in a stretch of the Vilcanota that almost no tourist walks, sits a ceremonial complex called Cochabamba, a carved altar stone, 14 ritual baths, a network of channels fed from the river, built to carry water into the site. Archaeologists had known about it for decades. What they did not know was how much of it the forest was still holding. So a team led by Bartłomiej Chmielewski of Wrocław, University of Science and Technology, mounted a laser scanner on a drone and flew it over the canopy. LIDAR works on a simple principle. The instrument fires hundreds of thousands of laser pulses a second at the ground below. Most of them strike leaves and bounce back early, but a small fraction slip through the gaps between them, hit bare earth, and return a fraction of a second later. Software throws away everything that hit vegetation and keeps only the late returns. What is left is the shape of the ground with the forest deleted. 12 structures. That is what came back. 12 buildings that had never appeared on a map, a survey, or an excavation report. Sitting under the trees at the edge of a site, archaeologists thought they had already documented. The findings were published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in January of 2022, with specialists from Peru's own National Archaeological Park of Machu Picchu working alongside the Polish team. Here's the part that should bother you. These buildings were not hidden in some distant valley. Dominika Siczkowska of the University of Warsaw's Center for Andean Studies, who worked on the survey, pointed out that they stood within about 60 feet of the main ceremonial sector. 60 feet. Researchers had been walking past them, standing next to them, and studying the altar stone beside them for years. And the detail that matters most is not the count. It is the workmanship. When the team examined the scans, the new buildings had been put up far more crudely than the ceremonial core a stone's throw away. Different hands, different purpose. Siczkowska has argued, based partly on weaving tools recovered in earlier excavations, that Cochabamba was maintained largely by women. Weaving was women's work in the Inca state. The rough buildings look like where they lived. So one drone, flown over one overgrown valley, added 12 buildings to a site that has been studied continuously since 1911, which raises the obvious question about every other valley nobody has flown. But it raises a sharper one first. If Cochabamba was staffed, if there were people living in those rough buildings, tending the baths, keeping the channels clear, then somebody had to supply them. Somebody decided who went there. And 1.5 years after that survey was published, a different team went looking for exactly those people in the one place nobody had checked: their bones. In July of 2023, a team led by Lucy Salazar and Richard Berger of Yale University, working with the geneticist Lars Ferin Schmitz, published something in the journal Science Advances that nobody had attempted at Machu Picchu before. They sequenced the dead, 68 individuals, 34 buried at Machu Picchu, and 34 buried in Cusco, the imperial capital, as a comparison group. That second set is what makes the result mean anything. Without it, you have a list of ancestries. With it, you have a contrast. The expectation was straightforward. Machu Picchu sits in the southern highlands of Peru. The people buried there should have been, in the main, southern highlanders, locals. Staff drawn from the surrounding valleys. 7. Out of 34, only 7 carried ancestry that traced to the southern highlands at all. About a third of the group carried significant Amazonian ancestry, and not from one place either, but from at least 2 separate regions of the Amazon basin. 13 more had blended ancestry, mixed lines reaching as far east as what is now Brazil and Paraguay. Lowland rainforest ancestry at 8,000 feet, in a cloud forest citadel that the guidebooks describe as an imperial country palace, and the Cusco comparison sharpened it. That population was diverse too, but diverse in a different pattern. Whatever assembled the people at Machu Picchu was not the ordinary churn of an imperial capital 50 miles away. It was specific to the site. Salazar was careful about what that means, and the distinction matters. There were no slaves in the Andean world, she has said. Individuals were removed from their ethnic homelands and assigned to serve the Inca royal families for life, including as retainers at country estates like this one. Not captives, not migrants either. People relocated by imperial policy, hundreds of miles, and kept. Across all 34, the team found exactly one close family relationship, a mother and her daughter. In a population of that size, drawn from a normal community, you would expect siblings, cousins, grandparents. There were none. These people were not families who moved together. They were individuals, selected one at a time from different corners of an empire 2 million square kilometers wide. And then there are the burials themselves. Amazonian, coastal, highland, mixed, it made no difference. They were all interred together, in the same major cemeteries, with no separation by origin whatsoever. So the word that needs to come out of the guidebook is retreat. A retreat is somewhere a household goes to rest. What the genomes describe is an installation, staffed by people brought in deliberately from across a continent, mixing on arrival, and buried where they served. Which leaves the question the bones cannot answer. If the empire went to that much trouble to put those particular people on that particular ridge, then whatever they were maintaining up there was worth it. And to understand what that actually was, you have to stop looking at the buildings and start digging underneath them. Every photograph ever taken of Machu Picchu shows you less than half the site. Not because of the angle, because of the ground. When the American civil engineer Kenneth Wright began surveying the citadel's water systems with Peruvian colleagues, he was not asking archaeological questions. He was asking the questions an engineer asks about any structure on a steep, wet slope. Where does the water go, and why has this not slid down the mountain? The answer he arrived at, and the figure that has stood in the engineering literature ever since, is that roughly 60% of the construction effort at Machu Picchu went into work that is invisible. 60%. Underground. Dig into one of those terraces and here is what you find. At the surface, topsoil deep enough to grow in. Beneath that, a bed of sand and finer material. Beneath that, coarser gravel. And beneath that, crushed granite chips left over from cutting the stone, packed down as fill and running meters deep before you reach anything natural. That is not a garden bed. That is a graded filter, built in layers, each one sized to pass water down to the next without carrying the soil above it along too. Which means the terraces are not really farmland with a view. They are the visible top course of a drainage machine. Water enters high on the site, runs through cut stone channels, spills across the terrace faces, and then goes down. Through the topsoil, through the sand, into the gravel, into the rubble, and out at the base of the mountain. It does not pool. It does not carry the slope away with it. It has been doing that for roughly 600 years on a mountainside that takes around 2,000 millimeters of rain a year, and it is doing it this morning, unmaintained, with nobody supervising it. Now hold that against the constraints. No iron tools, no wheel, no draft animals capable of hauling loads up that ridge. And in the finest masonry, no mortar at all between the stones. The people who built this understood something modern civil engineers had to derive mathematically. They understood that on a slope like that, a structure fails from underneath. Water gets into the soil loses its strength, and the whole thing goes. So they spent more of their labor on the part nobody would ever see than on the part everyone would. One honest caveat, because it matters. 60% is an estimate of construction effort. It is not a measurement of hollow space, and it is not a claim that there is a hidden city down there. There are foundations, fill, and drainage. That is what is under the terraces, but it is enough to reframe the entire site. The postcard is the roof of the thing, and it explains how Machu Picchu survives the rain. It does not begin to explain how it survives the earthquakes. For that, you have to go below the foundations entirely, into the rock the Inca chose to build on. Peru sits on one of the most seismically violent margins on Earth. Cusco, 50 miles away, has been flattened more than once. Machu Picchu, on a narrow ridge, on a slope, built without mortar, has never suffered significant structural damage from an earthquake in 600 years. Rualdo Menegat, a geologist at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, spent 11 years working out exactly why that is. 4 expeditions, satellite imagery cross-checked against measurements taken on the ground, and then checked again with Peruvian geologists, archaeologists, and ecologists before he presented any of it. He put the results in front of the Geological Society of America at its annual meeting in Phoenix on the 23rd of September, 2019. What he mapped was a fracture network, not one crack. A whole system of them, at every scale, from millimeter fissures running across individual boulders up to faults more than 170 kilometers long. Some of those larger structures are the same faults that lifted the Central Andes over the past 8 million years. And they run in 2 directions. One set trends northeast to southwest. The other trends northwest to southeast. They cross underneath the citadel and form an X. Menegat's argument is that this is not where the Inca happened to build. It is why they built there. Start with the stone. Fractured bedrock does not give you a solid mass to quarry. It gives you granite already split along clean natural plains, which is the answer to a question people have asked for a century, standing in front of walls where you cannot slide a card between the blocks. The rock arrived pre-broken along usable faces. Menegat has put it bluntly. Without a fractured substrate, he argues, a site like this could not have been built in the high mountains at all. Then the water. Fractures channel rain and melt water through the mountain, delivering it toward the site rather than away from it. And then the movement. Fractured ground has somewhere to go. It absorbs and disperses seismic energy instead of transmitting it whole into a rigid foundation. The detail that finishes the argument is the layout. Menegat found the citadel's sectors, its agricultural fields, its individual buildings and staircases, all oriented along the trends of those faults. The city is a readable map of the geology beneath it. And Ollantaytambo, Pisac, and Cusco itself sit on comparable intersections. Whatever this was, it was a method, not one lucky ridge. Now, the honest position. This was a conference presentation and an interpretive argument, not a settled matter. Other geologists accept the fracture mapping entirely, but read the site selection differently, as builders following workable stone and reliable water, rather than deliberately engineering against earthquakes. That objection is reasonable and it has not been closed. But either way, the choice was not random. And there is one more piece of precision on that ridge that has nothing to do with rock at all. At the highest point of the citadel, on top of a stepped platform of terraces, sits a piece of carved granite that was never quarried and never carried anywhere. It was cut in place, directly out of the bedrock of the summit. The name attached to it is Intihuatana, roughly translated the place where the sun is tied. For most of the 20th century, it was cataloged as a ritual object, ceremonial, decorative, a carved stone on a high platform, which is the sort of thing that gets filed under religion and left alone. Then people started measuring it. Its principal edges sit close to true north, not magnetic north, which is where a compass points, and which wanders across the globe by tens of kilometers a year and has moved substantially since the 15th century. True north. The geographic pole. The axis the planet actually turns on. A compass will not find it for you. You find it by watching the sky, tracking where shadows fall shortest, and repeating that observation across years. And the stone is not the only thing on that ridge lined up with the sky. The astronomer David Dearborn, working with archaeologists at the site, documented the building now called the Torreon, the curved tower on the eastern side of the citadel. One of its windows frames the sunrise at the June solstice. Not approximately. The light enters, crosses the window, and falls on a carved block inside on the mornings around the solstice and at no other time of year. That is not decoration. That is an instrument built into the masonry for fixing a date. The caveat, and it is a real one. Precise figures for the Intihuatana's alignment get repeated online with more confidence than the published work supports, and its exact function is still argued over. Some researchers read it as a gnomon, a shadow caster for tracking the sun through the year. Others read it as a sighting stone aimed at features on the horizon. Nobody has closed that. What is not argued over is the pattern, because look at what has now accumulated on this one ridge, a site placed on an intersection of faults that required 11 years and satellite imagery to map, a drainage system that consumed more labor underground than the visible city cost above it, a workforce assembled by policy from across 2 million square kilometers, and stonework on the summit fixed to the axis of the planet and the movement of the sun. 4 different disciplines, 4 different centuries of tooling. Nobody coordinated them. They all describe the same thing. Not a palace that happens to sit somewhere beautiful. A site chosen, engineered, staffed, and oriented deliberately on 4 axes at once. Which means the question worth asking is no longer how they built it. It is what the word for a place like this ought to be, because the one currently printed in every guidebook is doing an enormous amount of quiet damage. The word is retreat. Sometimes estate, sometimes country palace. It appears on interpretive boards, in tour scripts, in the opening line of nearly every article written about the site. And it carries a specific idea with it. Leisure, a second home. Somewhere an emperor went to get away from the business of running an empire. Set that against what 4 independent lines of evidence have now established. The location was selected on geology that takes satellite imaging and a decade of fieldwork to characterize. The ground beneath the terraces consumed more construction effort than everything standing above it, and was engineered in graded layers to move water down a mountainside without taking the mountain out with it. The people who lived and worked there were relocated by imperial policy from across a continent, most of them from nowhere near the southern highlands, and buried together regardless of where they came from. And the stonework on the summit is fixed to the axis of the planet. That is not a holiday house. That is infrastructure. Sited by geology, drained by engineering, staffed by administration, oriented by astronomy. 4 systems, integrated, on one ridge. And here is what the word retreat costs. It tells you the site is finished, understood, photographed, cataloged, done. Which is precisely the assumption that let 12 buildings sit undetected in the tree line at Cochabamba, 60 feet from a complex researchers had been excavating for years, until somebody flew a drone over it in 2022. 1 valley, 1 flight, 12 structures, Nobody has flown the others. The Machu Picchu Historic Sanctuary covers roughly 32,000 hectares of cloud forest, most of it steep, most of it under canopy, and almost none of it surveyed by LiDAR. On the evidence of the one valley that has been scanned, the reasonable expectation is not that the site has been fully mapped. It is that we do not currently know how large it is. Meanwhile, the pressure on it keeps building. More than 1 million visitors a year now walk a site whose load-bearing structure is the part underneath them, built for a resident population in the hundreds, and never tested against anything approaching these numbers. Peru's own conservation planning has flagged the strain on paths, drainage, and access roads repeatedly. And the long-stalled Chinchero Airport, frozen for years in the wake of the Odebrecht corruption investigations, is moving again, with capacity that would multiply arrivals into the Sacred Valley. None of that is a conspiracy. It is a straightforward mismatch. The volume is being planned against the version of the site that exists in the guidebook, the finished one, the palace with a view. Not against the one the last few years of evidence actually describe, which is larger than the map, structurally dependent on ground nobody can see, and still, in significant part, undiscovered. The Inca left no writing. Everything we know about their intent was reconstructed from what survived, and for 5 centuries what survived meant what was visible. Walls above the grass, terraces in the sun, the parts that photograph well, which turn out to be less than half of what was actually built. The rest was designed never to be seen. Crushed granite packed meters deep. Drainage running blind through the fill. Foundations laid into fractured rock, chosen for the way it would move. The labor that went into that has no audience, no view, and no photograph, and it is the reason the view exists at all. That is the part worth sitting with. The achievement people travel across the world to look at is the smallest achievement on that ridge. The real one was buried on purpose, and it has outlasted everything above it. 1 valley scanned, 12 buildings nobody knew were there, and 32,000 hectares of cloud forest that nobody has looked under yet.